While King Charles delivered a remarkable address to Congress yesterday, bringing a bipartisan joint session to its feet multiple times on issues like support for NATO, Ukraine, and checks on executive power.
Today, I am here on this great occasion in the life of our nations to express the highest regard and friendship of the British people to the people of the United States. Ours is a partnership born out of dispute, but no less strong for it. We can discern that our nations are in fact instinctively like-minded, a product of the common democratic, legal, and social traditions in which our governance is rooted to this day. Drawing on these values and traditions, time and again, our two countries have always found ways to come together. This, I believe, is the special ingredient in our relationship. As President Trump himself observed during his state visit to Britain last autumn, the bond of kinship and identity between America and the United Kingdom is priceless and eternal. It is irreplaceable and unbreakable. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, when NATO invoked Article 5 for the first time, and the United Nations Security Council was united in the face of terror, we answered the call together, as our people have done so for more than a century, shoulder to shoulder through 2 world wars, the Cold War, Afghanistan, and moments that have defined our shared security. Today, Mr. Speaker, that same unyielding resolve is needed for the defense of Ukraine and her most courageous people. From the depths of the Atlantic to the disastrously melting ice caps of the Arctic, the commitment and expertise of the United States Armed Forces and its allies lie at the heart of NATO, pledged to each other's defense, protecting our citizens and interests, keeping North Americans and Europeans safe from our common adversaries. The U.S. Supreme Court Historical Society has calculated that Magna Carta is cited in at least 160 Supreme Court cases since 1789, not least as the foundation of the principle that executive power is subject to checks and balances.
They like checks and balances now.
They appear to. Join the conversation, we have MS Now contributor Mike Barnicle, U.S. national editor, columnist at the Financial Times, Ed Luce, writer-at-large for the New York Times, Elizabeth Buemiller, and presidential historian and Pulitzer Prize-winning author Jon Meacham joins us. And Willie, King Charles filling a lot of different roles during that address to Congress, including truth-teller and historian.
Yeah, truth teller coated in a bit of sugar. He was funny and self-deprecating, charmed the chamber there. And the hands you saw over his, I guess it was his left shoulder, clapping for checks and balances were those of Speaker Mike Johnson, who has looked the other way on that important role of Congress over the last couple of years. Jon Meacham, I'm curious about all of your thoughts about what we saw yesterday, both there in the Chamber of Commerce and at the state dinner last night at the White House. King Charles, as I said, he was funny and he was charming. He flattered Donald Trump appropriately because he knows the way to the man's heart, but also embedded in all of that critiques of the administration and reminders of what the special relationship means on a practical level.
Yeah, Willie, I don't understand why people keep saying this was subtle. It seemed pretty clear to me. I mean, let's give His Majesty credit. What was subtle about doing the line about executive power and then waiting for the applause? He's like Bob Hope. He was waiting. It was perfect. What I found so striking is it took a hereditary monarch from a nation and an empire from which we declared independence and fought an unlikely successful war 250 years ago. We withstood their attempt to come back and relitigate it in combat in 1812. It took him, a man who is in his job because of the person to whom he was born, to remind us that at the heart of our tradition is that no matter to whom we were born, we are equal before the eyes of the law and the eyes of God. And we can ponder that irony all we want, but it was a reminder of why the British Constitution has a head of state. And it was, I think, an incredibly insightful, which is to say, we don't need Walter Bagehot here, right? We don't need John Locke to tell us what we need to get right. But sometimes you have to hear it. And I thought that was brilliant. The only other thing I will say is last night in his toast, the king told the story about Christmas 1941 when Churchill got out of the bathtub. FDR came in the room in the White House, and he says, "Oh, Winston, I'm sorry." And Churchill looks at him and says, "Oh, no, Mr. President, as you can see, I have nothing to hide from you." The key part of that story, I think, is that FDR later said to his secretary, Grace Tully, Grace, he's pink and white all over. So that's an important detail that I don't think made it into the public record.
Ed Luce, I was speaking yesterday with someone who has been with the king quite recently. And the assessment of his speech from this person last night to me was that it was his emergence, his coronation, if you will, as a global leader. That he met the moment with the insight, talking about alliances, talking about friendships, talking about global responsibility, referencing NATO, referencing the environment in ways that the British people, I don't think, have heard him speak to that. I'm wondering if you agree with that kind of an assessment.
Yeah, I think it's a very good assessment. I should remind you that his first speech to a foreign legislature was a few weeks after he was coronated, and it was in Germany. He went over and spoke to the German Bundestag, and he spoke in German. And that had a really huge effect on Anglo-German relations. But in terms of what will be remembered about however long or short his reign may be, this will clearly be the cherry on the cake. It was an extraordinary performance, I thought, that he could bring up from the Magna Carta onwards, and indeed before the Magna Carta, through the Glorious Revolution, the Bill of Rights of 1689, which put his ancestors in a gilded cage, by the way. That was when the monarchy was really sort of made constitutional rather than absolute. That he could get from that sort of brief history lesson up to our shared and ancient desire to have checks on executive power, checks and balances, and have, as John pointed out, the vice president who's doing his best to row in the opposite direction, and the speaker jump to their feet, or at least feel obliged to jump to their feet and applaud this clarion call for checks and balances on overweening executive power. That the descendant of George III could do this, I don't know. It's sort of Alice in Wonderland. I felt like I'd gone down a rabbit hole. It was quite a moment.
So, Elizabeth, we know President Trump is actually quite fond of the monarchy. He is delighted in his previous visits to London. He spoke even yesterday about how his mother apparently had a crush on young then Prince Charles some decades ago. The White House, though, also loved to do their trolling. They put up a picture of Trump and the king with the phrase "two kings," to get the predictable outrage from Democrats. But I want to take to you the point that was sort of just made here by others, this idea that at least for one day, a sense of normalcy returned to Washington. You had Republicans cheer things like checks and balances and alliances and the like. Do you think, though, this was just a fleeting moment, and as soon as the king leaves town, it'll be business as normal for the GOP?
Well, obviously, we shall see. But I think it's perhaps a light towards the future, a future post-Trump. Because as you point out, it was Democrats and Republicans applauding Charles. I noticed especially that he spoke up for Article 5, and noted after 9/11 that the Europeans, it was the first time it was invoked, and the Europeans came to our defense. And he said also we should use the same unyielding resolve needed for Ukraine. So he was he touched all sorts of topics that our Republicans are not talking about. So I think it was perhaps a look toward what we might look to after 2028. And it was a brilliant trip on the part of the British. Trump, as we know, is quite enamored of the monarchy. My colleague Sean McCreesh read this morning that he was putty in the king's hands. And so it was also good to see Trump on very good behavior, sticking to a script almost the entire day. Think about the way Trump treated and J.D. Vance treated President Zelensky when he was here a little over a year ago. Look at the difference here. So I think it was quite an extraordinary trip.
Jon Meacham, I know that in 2016 when we talked about the rise of Donald Trump, you had said often that populism was a strong starter, but not a great finisher. Yesterday, when we were talking to Katty Kay following the president's speech, Katty was talking about how it's extraordinary that it seems in short order, this rise of populism that we've seen over the decade has fallen in Hungary. It's really fallen in Poland, too. If you look at Donald Tusk, Le Pen repeatedly goes into the final weeks of an election expecting to win and ends up getting beaten by 20 points. And Katty was recalling an interview she had a decade ago in 2016 and post-Brexit, post-Trump, and asked someone, how long should we expect populism to rise? And his answer, about a decade. It takes about a decade in these times for people to realize that the promises they make are all lies, that the attacks against the very institutions that make countries great actually undermine their daily lives. And we were just remarking that here you have the president with approval ratings, I think Reuters yesterday, 34%. Others have had him at 36%. Historically low. He's moving to where George W. Bush and Harry Truman were at the end of their terms. I'm curious. Nobody wants to predict the decline of Donald Trump's political power because he is a survivor, and he has been a survivor since the mid-'70s. But there you have it, a 34% approval rating at the same time Orban is collapsing, at the same time Netanyahu is facing real challenges, at the same time that we're seeing Putin on the ropes and just wildly outmaneuvered by Zelensky in Ukraine.
Well, I think populism, let's use a synonym, or not a synonym, but another term quickly, nationalism, right? There's been a kind of, since 2015, there's been this nationalist maneuver in the country, movement in the country. It's about closing borders. It's about allegiance to your own kind. It is a reaction to globalization. It's a reaction to the disorienting effects of a globalized world, not unlike what happened in the 1920s, which was the rise of isolationism and protectionism, a ferocious limit on immigration in 1924, a bill that was not really undone until 1965. You had the rise of the Second Klan. You had science versus religion in Tennessee in an apparent attempt to disprove Darwin. We outlawed Darwin. And you had this media moment, too, where radio was bringing the world into people's houses. So how did people react? They reacted poorly. And it was a Fortress America moment. And we know how that decade turned out, right? And so one of the things that does recur when we're lucky enough to have it recur, so I'm not saying it's a natural thing, is that we remember that what truly makes the country great is not nationalism, but patriotism, which is an allegiance to an idea. The idea that King Charles talked about yesterday, that there is a rule of law, there is a line for Magna Carta, as Ed was saying, through the Glorious Revolution, through the Declaration, Constitution, Bill of Rights, the Reconstruction Amendments. We have a story to tell that's about our individual dignity, and to build walls to separate ourselves from that tradition because of an allegiance to our own kind is to reject the creed to which we are supposed to ascribe ourselves. And I think we have again and again recognized, usually at the last possible moment, since we're in a British moment here, I will quote Churchill, who said, "You can always count on the Americans to do the right thing once they've exhausted every other possibility." I think we are pretty close to that. But the story we have to tell is the story that the King of England told yesterday. The way, and the irony and the remarkable thing about a globalized world in 2026 is that the salvation of the American Republic will require understanding the ideas and acting on the ideals former king brought to us yesterday.
And how extraordinary it was the King of England who came and figuratively shook Congress by its lapels to remind them of that story.